Welcome to the Limerick's Life podcast with your hosts, Sharon Slater
and Peter.
Hi all, and welcome to episode 3 of the Limerick's Life podcast. I'm Sharon and I know about history.
I'm Peter and I don't know about history. So what are you going to tell me about this time?
Well, on this episode we take to the high seas. How much do you know about a Limerick man who survived for months on a deserted island?
Absolutely nothing. But I have watched a lot of TV on deserted islands. So I wonder if this one's going to be like Castaway with a Wilson, or it's going to be more Lord of the Flies.
Well, before we jump ahead of ourselves, let's start at the beginning, back here in Limerick, where on the 5th of July, 1856, James Robert McGhie was born. His parents were William McGhie and Joanna Musgrave. A few weeks after he was born, James was baptised in the Presbyterian Church on Glentworth Street. The church was until recently used as McCurran's printers.
It's a very nice spot. A lot of people would miss it. So McGhie doesn't sound like a Limerick name. It sounds more Scottish. Can you tell us about his family?
Yeah, you're right. McGhie is a Scottish name. You could tell as well that he was baptised in a Presbyterian church. Usually the Scots coming over would have been Presbyterians. So what happened with the McGhies was James's grandparents moved over from Scotland in the early 1830s, bringing his father over as an infant. So James was really first generation born in Limerick of his family. And
so he was the first proper Limerick one out of them.
He was. Well, he had aunts and uncles, but out of his direct line.
His lot, yeah.
James was the eldest of 8. So that when they came to Ireland, they took on the Irish habit of having large families. So sadly for James, though, 3 of his brothers, he had 3 brothers, and they all died quite young. Oh. Some as children and one as a young adult. Oh. But all his sisters had extremely long lives. 3 of them lived until the 1950s.
So it's the males that are cursed in this family.
Absolutely. Even his father died very young, aged only 39.
39 is very young.
And that left James as the head of the household. And as head of the household, he took over the operation of the family mill out in Ballinclough. Well, James worked there mostly, but we know that he worked for Speight's as well.
Mm-hmm. So all the other males in the family were cursed. How was James's health?
He tried to live a healthy life, and every summer he would go to Kilkee, and we all know about Kilkee from the last episode. We know about
Kilkee now.
But when he was in Kilkee, he would swim across the bay, so he was quite healthy in that respect.
Yeah.
He didn't smoke and he didn't drink. But in spite of all of this, he was diagnosed with rheumatism, and that affected his bones. He always had an ache and would carry a walking stick.
That's the classic McGhie curse right there.
It was. If you're a man, you're going to get knocked down with something.
Yeah. So
on the advice of his doctor in 1886, he decided to embark on a long sea voyage for fresh air, because doctors, they had their own way of prescribing treatment.
It was a very different time back then. It was. Have some cocaine, that'll make you feel better.
We remember from our first episode what they were doing for rabies bites.
Oh, yeah.
So in 1886, he packed his bags, leaving his mother and only living brother in charge of the mill, and departed for Australia.
Oh. Did he leave from Limerick, or did he have to go to Dublin for the ship?
Well, although there were ships leaving from Limerick for Australia, James decided to go to London first.
Did he go by himself or with someone?
Well, we know that his sister Alice waved him off. I'm not sure if she was in London at the time or travelled with him. Mm-hmm. And his friend John Cullen travelled with him and went with him to Australia. The 2 men boarded the P&O liner, the SS Clyde, on the 5th of November, 1886, heading for Melbourne, Australia.
So how long would a journey like that take?
Well, it really depended. It depended on the time of year. It depended on the weather. It depended on who was stoking the fire in the steamship.
Mm-hmm. But lots of factors.
So many. This one was relatively uneventful. When it sailed from London to Australia, it took just over a month, and the ship landed on the 19th of December, 1886.
A month is a long time to be at sea. Was the boat fancy, or is it one of those ones that's all about just getting where it needs to go?
The Clyde was only 5 years old at the time, so it was a pretty new ship.
Yeah, new, modern for the time.
And it was intended for the Indian and Australian trade routes, so it knew the waters. And it had a dual purpose. Sometimes it would carry 128 first class and 48 second class passengers, or it would carry 500 troops.
That's a lot. That's way bigger than I thought it would be, just imagining the boat in my mind.
It was a big boat.
So do we know if he was first class or second class on the ship?
I don't know if he was first class or second class passenger, but either way, it wouldn't have been the worst ship to travel on to Australia.
Comfortable enough, so.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a lot better than what happened later.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. James met his cousin down in Australia and spent a few months in Australia building up his health again. His cousin gave him a revolver as a keepsake, and James went to a gunsmith and had some bullets made for the revolver. After a few months, though, he started feeling homesick.
Was Melbourne lacking stuff that they had in Limerick, or was it the people and the place itself that he was missing?
Well, Melbourne was nothing like Limerick. He had probably started to feel better from the lack of rain.
That'll do it.
But he was ready to come home. And in the docks in Melbourne was a ship he recognised, the Derry Castle, owned by his previous employer, the Spates and Sons.
Oh, it's a coincidence.
After chatting to the captain of the ship, Captain Goff, he booked passage on this. It was a cargo ship.
Cargo ship. So very different from his trip over to Australia.
The ship was completely different than the one he came on. The Derry Castle was an iron ship built in Glasgow in 1883 and operated out of Limerick for the Spates and Sons. It was named after the castle the Spates owned on the banks of Lough Derg.
So you keep mentioning the Spates and Sons. Who exactly were they?
Well, they were a merchant family, and they were involved in some of the most important and some of the most heinous actions in Limerick in Tipperary history.
Oh no.
Yeah. So we might dedicate an entire podcast to the Spates themselves.
We'll get back to them for sure.
One note is that the Spates decades earlier were involved in another maritime disaster, which is pretty widely known in Limerick. The story of the unlucky cabin boy.
I know that one. I know that history. I know one.
I knew you'd know one. A few years ago, I was involved in a documentary for RTE Documentary on One called The Custom of the Sea, which goes into great detail about that story. So if anybody wants to look that up, it's a great podcast, and not just because I'm on it.
It helps though.
Getting back to James's story. On the 12th of March, 1887, the Derry Castle set sail from Geelong, Australia for Falmouth, England, loaded with 17,824 bags of wheat.
That's a lot of wheat.
Yeah, the grain running ships would depart Australia, sail south of New Zealand, across the Pacific to Cape Horn, and back up the Atlantic to England or Ireland. And it would usually take about 2 months for them to take that return journey.
So his journey to Australia sounded relatively comfortable. How was it going back? Did he have his own room? Was he bunking it with others?
This was a completely different kind of ship. This was a cargo ship. There wasn't nice, fancy silverware anywhere. He may have only had a bunk in a room with other people. You know, on board coming back, the Derry Castle, there were 23 crew members and James McGhie.
Pretty small situation, so.
James wasn't the only Limerick person on board. Even though there was only 23 of them, there was still another Limerick person.
They're coming from Australia, so I imagine there's going to be a lot of Irish people, especially at that time.
Strangely enough, on this ship, there wasn't. Joseph T. Robbins of Limerick was one of the few Irish people on board.
Oh.
The others were from all over the world.
Yeah.
And Robbins was the first officer on the ship, and he was about 26-year-old, and he had recently been married.
First officer is just below the captain?
Just below the captain. Captain, first officer, then second mate. It goes down and down.
See,
give the
I
numbers.
know ship terms. I know all this stuff.
You got your nautical things down. This is how you've learned from your shanty song.
Yeah. So was the journey back to Limerick smooth sailing like the journey to Australia?
Sadly, not so much. The first week was fine. The first 7 days, the journey was okay. But then, in the middle of the night, on the 8th day, March 20th, 1887, a storm started to brew. It kind of came out of nowhere, and the crew didn't really expect it was going to cause the damage that it did.
Yeah.
And at 2 a.m. it struck. James was down in his quarters. You know, he was in his pajamas, he was in his PJs when he got
He was just
knocked on the
chilling,
door.
having a nice sleep.
And they called him out and got him to come up on deck. He was using his walking stick to hook onto the side of the ship to keep himself in place as it was rocking back and forth. It was like a perilous time.
Yeah.
And one of the waves came and hit the ship when they were in the Arctic waters around the Auckland Islands and pushed it into a bunch of submerged rocks. Oof. And within minutes, the ship started to disintegrate and started to sink. It was all just coming apart.
And that's it. Story's over.
That's it.
Everyone died.
That's the end. Luckily, our story doesn't actually end here. As the ship fell apart, the men braced themselves and started to swim out into the freezing waters. They had seen the visible shoreline of Enderby Island about 200 yards away, but it was like stormy water. It was like the film Titanic. Some didn't make it through the night in those freezing waters.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody took a whole door to themselves.
No. So the captain, did he go down with the ship?
That he did. Captain Goff and the first officer, our Robbins from Limerick, didn't make it. What they had done was they stayed behind on the ship as long as they could, passing life jackets and life buoys out to the others. Among the others who didn't survive was the second mate's terrier dog.
Aw.
Yeah. But
sad.
James did. James made it. He threw himself. He had managed to run downstairs and get some clothes on.
Mm-hmm.
So he wasn't in his pajamas anymore. He put on the clothes that he'd worn the day before. Then he jumped into the water with his life jacket and he swam as hard as he could towards the rocks and just kept going, being tumbled back and forth over and over again.
So all that swimming in Kilkee really helped him out?
It absolutely saved his life. When he got to the shore, he huddled down by a rock and yelled out for other people and heard another voice, and it was another one of the crew. Mm-hmm. They made themselves wait together for the night and just curled up until the dawn broke.
Yeah.
Everybody who survived saw James and were puzzled because he had gone to Australia for his health.
Yeah, and he was some random man with a cane to them, or a walking stick.
He was not the person they thought was going to survive.
Yeah.
So 8 of them in total survived.
So most of the people on the ship didn't survive. Were they able to recover much of the bodies so they have a burial for them?
Yeah, sadly, the majority of people didn't survive.
Yeah.
And the waves would be bringing their bodies back into the shore. And as they did, the survivors brought them back onto the island. And during the storm, the battered figurehead from the ship had been thrown inland, way further than anybody could carry it. And it was shunted into the ground. And it was here that they decided to bury the dead, to use the figurehead as a marker for the grave.
What was the figurehead design on this one?
Well, she was a busty woman. There's pictures of her as she was on the island, on Enderby Island, and now she's in Canterbury Museum in Christchurch, New Zealand. So a more permanent memorial to those who died was erected in that spot.
Oh, that's nice. So the island, was it the size of the island from Lost, or was it more like a random coastal island from Ireland?
It was small enough for some of the men to circumnavigate in a day. Mm-hmm. And on the first full day that they were there, after they pulled some of the people ashore and found where they were themselves, found their feet on land.
Got their bearings.
Some of the men took that trip and they found a tiny hut which was erected by the New Zealand government to aid castaways. As shipwrecks were so common in the area, the New Zealand government put these little huts on all these little islands.
It's very convenient for them.
Yeah. So the hut was about 6 foot by 4'6", and it was shaped like a tent. And usually they would be stocked with supplies so that if anybody was shipwrecked, they'd be able to take stuff from there.
Yeah.
But this one hadn't been tended to in a long time, and the men only found a bottle of salt. That was it.
That was all?
That was all.
Oof.
Yeah.
I mean, it's better than nothing, I suppose.
Luckily, the ship that they were on, the Derry Castle, had broken up not far from the shore.
Yeah.
So stuff started floating in pretty quickly. Okay. So on that first day, they got 2 tins of preserved fish and 6 pumpkins.
Fish, yes. That makes sense for a story about a deserted island. But pumpkin? I've never seen pumpkin in a deserted island story on the TV.
Well, they weren't carving faces out of them. They definitely were having dinner. I'm sure James, though, was dreaming of some Limerick staples like packing a tripe, crew beans, pig feet. So this flute, though, of pumpkins and tin fish was not going to sustain them for long.
Yeah.
They needed more food for the 8 people. As another one of the bodies washed ashore, it had a knife in the pocket. So they used that to help find food.
Yeah.
Well, before the food had them. Because the island was the home to some very large seals who might have looked at the men as dinner.
This is like, there's one really lucky thing that happens, then one terrible thing that happens, then another lucky thing.
The story of a castaway island. Yeah, it's always up and down. You get it in a good book.
Yeah.
So the second night, all the men were huddled together. And one of the men decided that he didn't want to sleep under a rock with the rest of the men. So he was going to go out on his own. So he went and he found a warm hole in the ground. The hole in the ground had been left by one of the seals. Oh. So he made a bed inside that. Unfortunately, though, the seal came back to go to his bed.
Yeah.
And bit the sailor on the leg. And the sailor, started screaming and running back to everybody else to, get away from this giant flopping seal that was running after him. Luckily, the sealers realized that if you tapped the seals on their nose with a piece of wood,
they'd just be confused.
Yeah, they were like, I don't understand. What has just bopped me on the nose?
Well said. And then just leaves.
And then they would be gone.
So did they figure out a better sleeping arrangement for the next days?
Yeah, for the next few nights, the 8 men squashed together in the hut for warmth and safety and slept as best they could. Mm-hmm. Now, remember, this was 6 foot by 4.5 foot.
These are 8 fully grown men.
These are 8 full-grown men. At least they were warm because it was getting into wintertime down that side of the hemisphere.
Yeah.
So what they needed more than anything was fire.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, they only had 1 box of wooden matches, but it was so cold and wet that they couldn't dry them.
Oh, yeah.
So because they needed fire to dry the matches to make the fire, it was a vicious circle.
Yeah, I've watched enough survival shows to know that fire is the most important thing.
Luckily, James had tucked away in his pocket one of those cartridges for the revolver.
Oh, yeah, the one his cousin gave him.
Mm-hmm. And he was worried about it. He didn't know what to do with it or how to work it without the revolver itself.
Yeah.
And on the 10th day, he decided to give it a go. He replaced the bullet of the revolver cartridge with a piece of cloth, a bit of cotton.
It's very smart.
Then he got one of the other sailors, because he didn't want to do it himself, to just whack the end of the cartridge with a sharp stone.
I wonder how he approached that person. Hey, come over here. Can you whack this bullet for me, please?
Well, they were all hungry and they all wanted fire, so he got the person who was most willing to take the risk. The rag, it didn't go on fire first. It kind of started smoldering. Mm-hmm. So the man who whacked it, picked it up and started waving in the air to try and get some air to catch onto it.
Yeah.
And then he threw it on the ground and it wasn't doing it. Somebody else came along and picked it up and started waving it on the air, and they were all blown. It was hysterical. But eventually they got a tiny little bit of enough of a spark to
work from it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I imagine the fire was a very big turning point in their story.
Yeah, it changed everything. Now they had warmth and a means of cooking food. James had described the raw seal meat they had been eating as tasting like rancid cod liver oil.
Ugh,
Yeah.
I don't like that image.
I'm sure the 6 pumpkins were gone by this stage
Yeah.
as well.
Did they have any cooking utensils, anything to work with the fire?
Yet on the island, they scavenged as much as they could from flopsam and jetsam. And there was an old boiler, and they used that to make a sort of pan,
Oh.
you know. So they had... you remember how much wheat there was
Yes.
on this ship?
There was a lot of wheat. I remember that much.
So the bags of wheat would sometimes float on shore. It was soaking wet and filled with salt water. But it was brilliant to throw into the soup that they were making. The
Yeah.
soup was made
It'll
of...
give them some nutrients
Exactly. So
and
it's
calories.
it was seal and wheat soup.
Seal and wheat soup.
Occasionally they throw in some bits of seaweed as well, you know, but imagine everything while they were throwing it in. They would be like, ooh, and now we're putting in potatoes and we're chopping up the carrots. It was...
Throw in the kitchen sink and everything.
yeah, they realized quickly enough that they were going to be there a while. So they started to build small grass huts, you know, with everything that they could get. They were pulling wood as soon as wood would be coming in off
Yeah.
the ship, bringing that up. Those bags of wheat, they'd be putting them into these huts to try and dry them out.
off. Yeah.
Exactly. And they did this. They kept going and going and going. Days rolled into weeks. Weeks rolled into months. And these 8 men, who could see in the distance a bit of land, were stuck there.
You said they were there for months already at this point. How did they ever escape?
It took a long time from the fire to the escape. They had fashioned flags out of sails and set them on 3 points on the island to attract attention. But they needed to attract attention of people who were going past, and nobody was going past.
Yeah, it's not a major shipping lane, I suppose.
They realised that they had to build a boat to get to the other island, but they had no tools to
Oh, yeah.
build a boat.
They had like a pan and a knife. That's not really the best for shipbuilding.
They had a pan, a knife, and then eventually they found a broken axe head. You know, just the axe head, not a stick to go
Yeah.
with it. And they started to fashion a boat out of the remnants of the Derry Castle. So they called it the Derry Castle Punt.
How big? Is it a boat or would it be more like a raft? Is it just enough to fit all of them?
Well, it was really nothing more than an oblong box.
Yeah.
It was 6 feet long by 2.5 feet wide. For all intents and purposes, it looked like a coffin.
Yeah.
But these were desperate men. This symbol of death might just save their lives.
I suppose you said they saw land in the distance. They probably don't have to go too far.
It's across some rugged waters. So 2 men, Sullivan and Rene, set off on the journey. And 2 days passed without any signals from the sailors. Back on Enderby Island, the 6 who were remaining didn't know what happened, whether they even made it, whether the punt was sunk and
Yeah.
the men were gone. But on the 3rd day, smoke appeared from Irbis Cove in Port Ross on the Auckland Islands, that bit of land that was jutting out on the other side.
So the stranded were able to see the smoke?
They could see the smoke.
Nice.
So they knew that they had landed.
Yeah.
At least they knew there was people over there.
Man,
And
I can't even imagine how happy you would feel in that situation.
you have to remember they had to go over there and they had to light a fire as
Yeah.
well and build that up. The adventurers soon returned to Enderby Island with supplies and clothes. So they had stuff. There was
Yeah.
stuff. And one by one, the survivors made it to the new island. They could only take 3 people at a time in the punt. So it was like that whole, fox, chicken, wheat.
Yeah.
back and forth.
I was just thinking of that story.
So finally, they were all on this new cove, and this was the 18th of June, 1887. So remember, they set off from Australia on the 12th of March. Their ship crashed on the 20th of March, and now on the 18th of June, they've made it to a new cove.
So now they're fine, they're rescued, everything's going well.
Oh,
More tribulations.
Not so quick. This was better than Enderby Island.
Yeah.
But it was still out of the way for passing ships. And it would take another month before Captain Drew came ashore from the seal poaching ship, the Arua, on the 19th of July, 1887.
I wonder if they got the seal that attacked your man early in the story. It's a little bit of vengeance.
It would have been such a sight for Captain Drew, though, to see these 8 men raggedy with beards down to their belly buttons, probably at this point, running out. You know, they probably thought they were hallucinating.
Yeah.
But it was a seal poaching ship. The castaways convinced him to take them to Australia.
Yeah.
But they did, via some more seal poaching grounds.
So now they're home free?
Not quite. The Arua was struck with a storm as well. The storm was so furious that the people on board that ship didn't know if they would make it.
The lads were just like, oh, not again.
Not another ship. Finally, after another arduous journey, they arrived at Hobson Bay, Victoria, on the 21st of September, 1887, never to return to Enderby Island again.
Yeah, I doubt any of them would complain about that.
As for Captain Drew of the rescue ship, he was imprisoned for 6 months for poaching after he landed in Australia, much to the disapproval of the general public.
Yeah, I can understand why you saved 8 people. Give them a break. Like, so the island, is it still uninhabited, or is there like a small town there now?
Well, recently I was contacted by James McGhee's great nephew.
It's a lot of greats.
3 greats. David Bennett, who had secured a True Young Explorer scholarship from Heritage Expeditions to visit the Enderby Island. It's still uninhabited, but he's now trying to help raise awareness for the conservation work in the subarctic.
Oh.
And the conservation work is by the New Zealand Department of Conservation and the charity New Zealand Nature Fund. So no people, just flora and fauna that need help.
I wonder if James ever went on a boat again. If I was him, I would just not go on a boat again. It's not happening.
Yeah, James had to make it back to Limerick.
Oh,
Remember,
yeah.
he had his business to tend to. So his only option at the time was a boat.
Yeah.
You know, there was no hot air balloons from Australia
No
to Limerick.
private planes.
Once again, he was on a boat going from Australia to Limerick via London, where he landed on the 10th of March, 1888. And from there, he came back to Limerick. You see, it was so strange for poor James because all of his friends and family would have thought that he was dead and they had mourned his loss and sold all his possessions. They would have read the report in the Munster News from the 27th of August. So, like, well over a month beforehand, there was a report in the local presses saying, I'm going to read this out. We regret to learn that Mr. Francis Spate and Sons' splendid vessel, the Derry Castle, is so long overdue that hopes of her reaching England are nearly abandoned. So the family all thought he was dead.
Yeah, it's pretty grim.
They all mourned his loss. And he had to come back and go back to work. So he went back to the mill, but only stayed there a short time. His body was aching because he had the rheumatism to begin with.
Yeah.
And then he was on a deserted island eating, seals. So he ended up turning his hand to estate management, auctioneering, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. An occupation that would have had less toll on his weary body.
Yeah.
His brother and his mother had been taking care of the business. And only 3 years after he arrived back in Limerick, his last brother, his baby brother, Henry, died. Henry had taken part in a penny farthing. Wait for it. Wait for it before you start giggling.
Okay, go ahead.
Henry had taken part in a penny farthing bicycling race and injured himself in the process.
Dying from a penny farthing race. It's such a unique way to go.
Well, the poor man, poor Henry. So he was in the bicycling race and he tumbled over it, big wheel first, and hit himself in the stomach and ulcerated his bowel. And
Oh,
he
man.
died a month later. And poor James had to be the informant for his death as well.
Yeah.
So James had taken care of him.
Did James ever end up having a family of his own, kids, or getting married or anything?
No, James never married. He lived in Ballinclough for a few years. There we know he kept a sheepdog, though, a black sheepdog,
Oh.
in 1892 because he was caught that same year without a license for the dog. Dog licenses were very important at the time
Oh, yeah?
because the government was trying to eradicate rabies from Ireland.
Ah, that
And-
makes sense. I didn't know that.
You know about rabies.
I know about rabies because of a certain monkey.
They succeeded in that task, and that's how come we have no rabies in Ireland, was because they were really strict on licenses for animals.
It's very interesting.
James moved into the city for the last few years of his life, living in a lodging house in Catherine Street. And on the 19th of January 1903, after dealing with the effects of anthrax for 2 weeks, he died in Barrington's Hospital, age 46.
Anthrax poisoning. That's a terrible way to go. How did he contract it? Do we know? Was that a common thing at the time?
It wasn't as uncommon as it is today. He probably caught it from a cow.
Yeah.
Poor James, he had terrible luck,
Yeah.
and still was another young man in his family to die.
46, you said that.
He was the eldest of the men at 46 to die, because his father was only 39.
Yeah. It's the McGhie curse for you. So where can we visit him?
He was buried in St. Munchin's Protestant churchyard with his family. His plot is in the centre of the graveyard, and it's surrounded by this really tall iron railing. So I'm not sure if James had this really tall iron railing put up or if somebody else had.
Yeah.
But it's there and he's not going anywhere. So do you have anything more to add?
No, that was a very interesting story. There was lots of ups and downs. A penny farthing related death in 8 men stranded on an island. That's an interesting story.
Well, if you have nothing more and I have nothing more, then let's say goodbye for today.
Bye-bye.
Find out more about this and other Limerick stories at limerickslife.com and check us out on our social media. You can find Limerick's Life on buymeacoffee.com. Mine's a decaf.
And mine's a latte.